Now, the second group, verse 41, others were saying, this is the Christ. This group had a clearer understanding of who Jesus was, and they had become convinced of his identity. Now listen, whether they saw him also as the prophet is certainly not clear. But one thing is clear. They believed that he was the Messiah and that they were willing to speak openly about it. If you look back at verse 13, no one was speaking openly for him for fear of the Jews. No one was willing to speculate out loud, or no one was willing to voice that, hey, this is truly the prophet. Because they feared the Jews. They feared being de-synagogued. So you have these two groups here. You have these two groups that make up the convinced. One group is convinced that he's the prophet. They don't really see him as the Messiah because, again, they have that understanding that the prophet to come and the Messiah were two different people. And you heard what we just read in Matthew chapter 11 about John the Baptist. You know, if they could handle it, he was the Elijah to come. Now, notice that John mentions the third group. And that third group's in verse 41. Also carries us down to verse 44. I like to call them the contrary. They heard what the previous group said, and they were contrary to it. Notice what they were saying. Surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is he? Has not the Scripture said that the Christ comes from the descendants of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So division occurred in the crowd because of him. Some of them wanted to seize him, but no one laid their hands on him. So not all in the crowd were convinced of Jesus as being the prophet or the Messiah. Some were ready to accept him. Others were still skeptical. Now notice their question. Their question implies a negative answer, and it actually illustrates in their mind how ludicrous the thought was that Jesus was the Messiah. Listen to it. They're actually scorning him. Surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is he? It's almost like you look back to Nathanael in chapter 1. You remember when Philip comes to him, he says, we have found the Messiah. He says, can anything good come from Nazareth? And Philip says, come and see. You know, come and meet him yourself. I like that. You know, you got a lot of people that are willing to give their opinion about what they don't believe about Jesus. Why can't we say to them, listen, why don't you come and see? Why don't you come and see for yourself? Put the burden of proof back on them, right? Well, notice some things that they were correct about. They were correct that the Christ comes from the descendants of David, from Bethlehem. But you'll notice here that no more than they said that, they dismissed it. They failed to examine Jesus thoroughly. If they had done their homework, they would have discovered that Jesus met both of those qualifications. He was a descendant of David, Matthew 1:1, and he had been born in Bethlehem, Matthew 2:1. But they hastily assumed, since Jesus grew up in Nazareth, he must have been born there too. That's what they assumed. And so John tells us in verse 43, as a result of the differing opinions about Jesus, a division occurred in the crowd. This is a good point to point out a principle. This incident illustrates the truth that Jesus Christ divides people. He divides people. Look with me at Luke chapter 12 and notice something that Jesus says. You get upset because you go home and you tell your family about Christ and that you got saved and no one wants to hear it. Because they haven't tasted of the heavenly gift either. So they think you're mad, you're ludicrous, you have a demon. They think you're nuts. They think you become religious. That's okay for you. Don't bring that in here in my home. Don't bring that and force that on me. Maybe you're around a coworker that feels that way. Or maybe it's a brother and a brother, or a brother and a mother or father or sister. Look what Jesus says. Verse 51. Do you suppose that I came to grant peace on earth? I tell you no, but rather division. For from now on, 5 members in one household will be divided. 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Jesus didn't come to bring peace. He came to divide. There would be a division. He divides believers from unbelievers. He divides those who walk in the light from those who walk in darkness. He divides the sheep from the goats. He divides the children of God from the children of the devil. And we're even told in Matthew 12:30 that you're either for Him or against Him. There's no middle ground. Well, we see in verse 44, third time, that since Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, there was an unsuccessful attempt made to seize Him, as was the case earlier with the crowd in verse 30. No one laid hands on Him. Why? Because His time had not yet come. It was not God's time for Him to go to the cross. This would occur 6 months later. But as I mentioned last time, chapter 7, we're beginning to see the hatred fume against Him. And Jesus keeps shutting them down, shutting down their arguments, shutting down their questions, questioning their motives. Tells them in the last text that we looked at that they don't even keep the law of Moses. One, because they're trying to kill Him, violating the sixth commandment. Secondly, because they're hypocrites. They've come up with some elaborate command about working on the Sabbath. And if a man picks up his mat and goes from point A to point B, he's working on the Sabbath. Because that's what happened in John chapter 5. When Jesus healed the man who had been sick for 38 years, He tells him to pick up his mat and walk. And they tell him, listen, you can't do that. The Sabbath police jumped in there and they said, you can't do that. You can't do these things on the Sabbath. And so they hated Jesus all the more because He was healing people on the Sabbath. And He tells them, He says, listen, you'll take a child, you'll take a son, and you will have him circumcised on the 8th day according to Genesis and according to the Mosaic law, and you'll do it even if that 8th day is the Sabbath. And here you're condemning me because I made a man well on the Sabbath. He said, you're hypocrites. You're judging with unrighteous judgment. You're judging by appearance. You're not judging by truth. Well, notice the fourth group, verse 45. They are the confused. John says, verse 45, the officers then came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they said to them, why did you not bring him? And the officers answered, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. And so the Pharisees then answered them, you have not also been led astray, have you? No one of the rulers or Pharisees has believed in him, has he? But this crowd which does not know the law is accursed. So unlike those in the crowd who either believed or rejected Christ, here the officers of the temple police, they were confused. They had been sent several days earlier by the chief priests and the Pharisees to arrest Jesus, and when they returned empty-handed, their superiors demanded, why did you not bring him? You know, and interesting, the officers did not claim that the crowd had prevented them from arresting Jesus, so that may have been a fact. Instead, they expressed their bewilderment. They expressed their amazement. They expressed their confusion. Notice what they say. Never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, we're told in verse 28 that when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at His teaching. For He was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. The scribes would always quote other rabbis. They would quote other people as their source of authority. Jesus quoted no one but Scripture. And He gave the true sense of the Scripture to them. Something to note about these officers who had went to arrest Jesus, they were actually Levites. They were religiously trained Levites. And you'll notice there that Jesus' words to them left them stunned. That's just what I like about this. When I see people respond to Jesus, those who oppose Him, those who want to discredit Him, those who want to shut Him down, what does He do? He shuts them down. And even at one point to where He asked a question of them, and at that point, they never asked Him another question.